Okay, well, thanks for having me here today. Again, I also wanted to thank the organizers. I was not expecting a huge crowd like this. I was thinking there would be 30 or 40 angry young activists. It's about 500 angry activists here, so that's good. So yeah, I'm going to be talking largely from the context of forest issues in British Columbia. I've worked on other environmental issues, but my main specialization has been on forestry issues, and I've had a lot of interaction with the media over the years in relation to forestry in BC. And this is, of course, a major issue in the province because this is a heavily forested region of the world. It's a big part of the world. It's the biggest part of the BC economy. And so the stakes are high when it comes to forestry, and you know that there's been a lot of conflict. Really, one of the dominant conflicts that has defined this province is the fight over BC's forests. So my perspectives have been informed largely as an environmental activist in the 1990s, largely through university-based groups with Forest Action Network and People's Action for Threatened Habitat, then in the 2000s through the Wilderness Committee, and just recently, new organization, the Ancient Forest Alliance. I remember back in the late 1990s when I was not part of the Wilderness Committee at that time, but I was talking to Paul George, the founder of the Western Canada Wilderness Committee, how I gained a really important insight that really showed me how important the media is in the outcomes for all environmental issues as well as any kind of aspect of society you're talking about. The Wilderness Committee was putting out almost 1 million educational newspapers every year. It was its own printing press, and the neighborhoods where it had volunteers going door to door putting out these newspapers. And I was asking him at the time, Paul, what's the point in the Wilderness Committee publishing so many of its own newspapers and, if people read it, so what? Then still the reality stays the same. Who cares if they read it? They're still going to go log these areas. And Paul said, what, you kidding me? It's the way that you actually achieve environmental change is through an educated citizenry. The key line, he said, is that it's an educated citizenry that exerts the ultimate lobby pressure on government. That really struck a note for me, because for a long time, I was kind of searching for what is it that causes the necessary pressure so that we can have environmental gains, the laws and the regulations and restrictions on what corporations can or can't do. And for a long time, I thought, start off as a science geek. Oh, it's my excellent scientific work on flying squirrels that will cause the premier to change his mind. And then after that, it's like, you know what, it's going to be the most radical militant tactics among the students at the university that'll change their mind. Like, everyone's in jail now, and they just log the area. And what I started to realize over time is there's important tactics and roles that need to be filled, whether it's with research, with lobbying, with direct action. But the most important thing is a lot of people understanding the issues, knowing, caring, and speaking up. Essentially, it's participation of a lot of people in democracy that makes it work and that drives forward these issues. If you look at the history of forest issues in British Columbia, at where the protected areas came from, at where the regulations came from, we're far away from where we need to go. But we have moved significantly, say, from the early 1990s to today, where back then we had about 2% of the province's productive forests under protection. Now we're approaching about 10%. And those millions of hectares of productive forest lands were not protected just because governments wanted to tie up billions of dollars of timber value just because they cared about biodiversity. It was because a lot of people pushed, and it became a political risk not to do the right things and to not restrict what the companies could or couldn't do. So in that context, I started to realize that the media is fundamentally important because public opinion actually matters. And I remember from 1994 to 1999, where this is the case study here, where it was the best example from my experiences of how things can go really sideways for environmental campaigns. It went, in those years, the Can West media, back then it was Conrad Black's media, I believe in the 1990s, there was, I don't know if some of you might remember that, but the coverage on old growth protests and old growth issues in this province was over the top biased. If there's ever a giant steaming pile of terrible stinking garbage that came out of the media, it was the Vancouver Lower Mainland media, the Sun, the Province, and Global TV that covered those issues. It was just over the top. I don't know if some of you remember that, but the way they covered the protests in the Great Bear Rainforest, in Clayoquot Sound, starting with the boycotts in 1994, with the protests in the Ilaho Valley, was just so insanely biased and wrong on the facts, so blatantly inaccurate. And so at that time, I started to realize that, holy smokes, we have a fundamental problem here. We're trying to influence public opinion to get these areas saved. Meanwhile, the dominant means by which people are getting the information here is totally over-the-top biased and wrong on the facts, especially on a lot of facts. For example, in the Great Bear Rainforest, the Newhawk First Nations, a group of groups, to come out and protest. So you had a whole whack of British Columbians, as well as many members of the Newhawk Nation who organized the thing. And then you had Greenpeace, which had a whole whack of the Vancouver activists, as well as literally like 5 Europeans who came out to these blockades. The spin in the media is that this is a bunch of dreadlocked, ill-informed Germans and Europeans coming to British Columbia, to our forests. They don't even know what's going on over here. What are they doing here to disrupt the economy and destroy jobs? And this sort of message of foreigners coming to protest in Canada, despite the fact that this was the local Native people, and the vast majority of people were British Columbians, like literally like 5 out of like 40 people were from out of the country. But the whole spin was on a couple of these people from Denmark and Germany. And from there, at all the protests, because I was at the time blockading logging roads in the Ilaho Valley, you'd be like people yelling out, the loggers yelling out, it was usually, go back to Europe. I'm like, me? And, go, get a job, get a haircut, get off welfare. And this is sort of the spin that you've heard a lot when you get these sort of protest movements, and it's sort of outsiders coming in to tell people what to do. It could be from other countries or it could be from other regions. At the same time, I was down in Oregon, and I remember the loggers there always had different lines. It was always like, go back to San Francisco, communists. The U.S. is always San Francisco and communism, and Canada is always is like Germany at the time. And then the other spin that you saw was about jobs, that environmentalists were coming to, that the reason there was massive unemployment in 1997 in the forest industry was because of the environmental protests and the blockades, and because of all the parks environmentalists had created. And this is something that was in the opinion pieces, in newspapers, in report after report. And in fact, I remember the front headlines of the Province newspaper in, I think it was 1994 or 1997. There's 2 particularly bad years. It was Greenpeace, will they destroy BC? And I was like canvassing for Greenpeace at the time through the kind of the Fraser Valley suburbs, and like Abbotsford. How's it going on from Greenpeace? Greenpeace, go back to Germany. We're destroying the economy. Kind of seeing sort of messages repeated again and again. And the fact is that actually, up until that point, there were virtually no protected areas. Today we've got the protected areas, but back then there were virtually no protected areas, and there was just a massive belief among people that the reason that there was an unemployment in the forestry was not because of the recession, not because of the downturn in the U.S. housing market at the time, not because of the cyclical prices of pulp and lumber, but it was because of parks, which was absolutely, at that time we might have added an extra 1% of protection to the coastal productive forests. So, the parks started to roll in, later in 1994 and then in the late 90s, and they still added up to a very small amount at the time. So there's a lot of misinformation. It was just over the top. Environmentalists were promoting misinformation, were emotional, but the science somehow was with the forest industry, despite the fact that any reporter who actually took the time to investigate and look into it would realize that even by the government's own satellite photos, about 75% of Vancouver Island's productive old-growth forests had been logged, including about 90% of the low-elevation valley bottoms. We've been getting down to the last remnants of productive old-growth. Meanwhile, you've still got a minister today, Pat Bell, the Minister of Forests, who says that we've got more old-growth forests today than we did historically in BC, which is nuts. And he said this on The Voice of BC in late September. And I'm like, wow, somehow 100 years of industrial logging has increased the amount of old growth. There's too many examples, but basically that era showed me how it was really important that we had increased media democracy and that there's regulations, and we've heard a lot about them in terms of restrictions on corporate concentration, so you can get a diversity of media, not under the ownership of one, increased public funding for media like the CBC. You've heard the various recommendations, and I certainly support that wholeheartedly. So there's different reasons why I see why there's media bias, and also the lack of investigative, in-depth journalism that's going on. And it's not always necessarily the fault of, per se, of the individual reporter, because over time I've gotten to know a lot of the reporters. Many of them are coming from a place of wanting to have more time to investigate things, but for various reasons, and they may understand more than I do, there's increasing constraints of why you actually have less reporting and less investigative type journalism that allows reporters to see through the facade and the shallow but very catchy arguments that come out of the corporations or government or the anti-environmental type of initiatives that are underway, which are very catchy on the surface, but it takes a bit of education and a bit of reading and insight to see through why those are actually incorrect. The bias comes from many places. It could simply be from the advertisers. Environmental groups tend not to advertise in the Vancouver Sun or in the province very much compared to back in the 1990s, the logging companies and the Forest Alliance. Forest Alliance was the big PR wing of the logging companies. They were putting out full-page ads. It's $10,000 back then for a full page in the Vancouver Sun every week. This is a constant thing. $10,000 is like, half your income for environmentalists for a year, right? And they're doing this like all the time, the full page ad sort of technique. So, there's certainly a bias towards the advertisers, as well as simply, the ownership. Conrad Black, luckily he's in prison now. Maybe there is a guy. But back then, there's a lot of that concern is that his papers are owned by the same company, not just, the Sun in the province, but all across the country. And I understand it's even more concentrated today. Was it Shaw bought out Can West as Post Media now? I'm not really exactly sure all the new changes. But also, I do like to point out that there also is a reflection in the orientation of media outlets according to the market. And much as I rant and rave about how terrible the media has been in the Lower Mainland, in Victoria, I have to admit that the media in Victoria as a whole has been quite comprehensive in covering environmental issues. And they can't have any blatant anti-environmental slant for the simple reason as a whole that the market in Victoria is more educated and more interested in environmental issues. That's the one. So if there's a recommendation I have, besides the necessary regulations that have to come into play through the law for media, it's that environmentalists have to learn to become our own media as well. We need to, ultimately, see Paul George, one of his main recommendations to me is, ultimately the only free press is your own press. You've got to say things in your own words and advocate things from a perspective of what you're saying as opposed to what somebody else says that they say you're saying. Any successful movement throughout history has had to have its, in the pre-internet times, its own mass production newspaper, and today with the age of internet, we've got a lot more tools now to be our own media. So I've been sort of slow, I must admit, at certain times in the uptake on new technologies, like when email was coming into effect in the late 90s, I'm like, what's the point in that? I'll just phone them. And over time, I'm like, actually, this is a very useful thing. When Facebook was coming in, it's like, these strangle kids in their facial books, what's the point in this? But actually, I've been sort of like an old man when it comes to this. But I realize how important the use of the internet is, and with basically finding a way to be your own media. It's not a way to substitute against democratization in the mainstream media here, but it does help you build up the grassroots level of education and participation that then, in many cases, is going to make it more difficult for media, the big mainstream media, to take an anti-environmental stance or to ignore those issues. So if you look at, this, generally the media hasn't been that progressive in this province, right? But if you look at the public opinion here, there's a solid about 30 to 40% of the province that's very progressive. And that wasn't because they were reading, the Vancouver Sun in the province all the time. They became that way. It's because of all the movements, the nonprofit organizations and the unions and everyone who were their own media by sending newsletters to their membership, by organizing public events like this. So by being our own media, it's important to say things in your own words and to reach out to a lot of people. So those of you involved in movements, one of my main recommendations is don't work on a small scale when it comes to outreach. Work on a big scale. It means that every event like this, and I've got my clipboard here, you pass around a clipboard so that you get everyone's emails, so that way you can add them to your email list. Set up a Facebook group. Through the Ancient Forest Alliance now, we've got, about 10,000 people on our Facebook groups, which grew very, very quickly in the span of a few months. We've got maybe about 8,000 people on our email list, and it's just by, going out to a lot of events and getting people's emails. And I would, highly recommend when you do newsletters, you get it out far and wide. Okay, so, and just a quick note as well, in terms of the particular reporters, I do want to point out that, in many cases, many reporters are trying their best. I wouldn't blame the individual reporters necessarily, something bigger at work, but in many cases, in order to understand issues, you need the time and you need the resources, and there have been a lot of cutbacks. And so in order to recognize that the Forest Alliance, for example, back in the 1990s, not the Ancient Forest Alliance, which is the organization, the Forest Alliance back then was an industry arm. You had to kind of look into it because they presented themselves as an environmental group with Patrick Moore, the co-founder of Greenpeace, as their head of the organization. So, well, there's a co-founder of Greenpeace, and he's speaking on behalf of the Forest Alliance. Well, that's obviously an environmental group. And it's sort of reported like that for the first several news reports, is that this is an environmental group saying that Greenpeace is out of line and that the environmentalists are going too far. Turns out it was funded by all the biggest logging companies, and Patrick Moore had become a turncoat and was working to fight the environmental movement. In order to understand that, we've lost the majority of the old growth forest. That old growth forest was not replicated by the ensuing second growth tree plantations. In order to understand a lot of these, what's going on, it does require the staff resources and the ability to have investigative journalism so their level of understanding is ratcheted up. That's increasingly difficult. In Victoria, we do have one environmental reporter, Judith Lavoie, but I don't think there's any others really, except for in the Tyee. You have actually heavy focus on environmental type reporting, but there's not a lot else going on in this province that way. What else here? And there's, here's just one more blatant example that blew me away of how crazy the bias is and how dangerous it can become for social movements if you don't have increased democracy in the mainstream media. In 1997, when we started blockading logging roads that year, it became increasingly dangerous because of all the hype in the media about the foreigners coming in to blockade logging roads, destroy the economy. They're going to lose their jobs as a result of these protests. The loggers at that point started to beat up the environmentalists in the woods. And this was not reported on very widely, but it was a very dangerous situation to be engaged in nonviolent protests. And it culminated in 1999 when there were almost 100 Interfor employees and contractors in the Ilaho Valley who descended on a camp of 7 environmentalists. And they ended up smashing the equipment and burning down the camp and then assaulting the protesters, so 5 of them had to be hospitalized. The headline in the newspaper the next day was that protesters told by the courts, because the courts had also issued an injunction to leave the area, and that there was a quick mention that there was a scuffle in the woods between the environmentalists who've been accused of sabotaging equipment and with the forestry workers. So people seem to think that, well, you know what, you don't know really what happened there, despite the fact that 5 environmentalists were in the hospital, and that there was 7 environmentalists against 100 loggers. What do you think happened? It's like the 100 loggers, oh, the hippies are coming, oh, and they're like fleeing the area. No, and the 7 hippies chasing them. No, like it was just the craziest headlines that happened. And whether it was intentional or not, I do believe that it doesn't help when you have a lack of investigative journalism in the province. And I suspect that's all around the world. But when I look at things like the BBC and the CBC and also the Tyee, you know, I do realize there are better examples out there. And so certainly I would you know, support initiatives for increased democracy in the media, and ultimately, because an educated citizenry exerts the ultimate lobby pressure on government, and media is the main means to do that, it's in all